Welcome to The Download. I'm Reid Mercer, and if you're joining us for the first time, the premise is simple. I followed the money, so you don't have to wade through the press releases. Let's talk about what's actually moving this week. So, Apple rolled out video podcast support. Big splash, lots of coverage. And on the surface, sure, it looks like a bold video-first strategy. Here's what the press release didn't say. This is a retention play. Defensive posture, not offense. We're going to stress test that narrative against real production economics and flag the variable I think nobody is pricing in correctly right now. 2 words, Netflix talent. Oh, and Rich Paul launched a podcast. Very low effort, deliberately so. And that is actually the story, because sitting right next to it is AbbVie running a branded podcast at CPMs that would make most podcast sales teams weep with envy. 2 opposite ends of the monetization spectrum, and both of them are telling us exactly where the underpenetrated demand actually sits. If you're leaving pharma revenue or celebrity IP optionality on the table, I want you thinking about that before Q3 closes. Then we get into regulation. The CPPA has new podcast-specific signals. I want to be precise about what this actually means, because this is not a watch list item. If your ad tech stack runs pixel-based attribution or device graph infrastructure, this is a Q3 action item, full stop. And while we're in that space, BBC Sounds dropped a format called Top Comment, and I'd frame that as a public broadcaster land grab that independent UK networks should be watching very carefully. We close with a forward look. 18 months. I'll use sports podcasts as the lens because completion rates and return listeners in that genre are telling a bigger story about engaged listening metrics than almost anything else in the market right now. All right, let's get into it. Starting with Apple's video rollout, what it actually signals about platform power dynamics, and why the real threat might not be coming from where everyone's looking. The first segment is up next.
Before we dive in, a quick reminder, we love hearing from you. If you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover, head to the link in the description and submit your question. We read every single one. All right, let's get into it. Apple made a move this week, and if you read the press release, you'd think it was about video. It's not. Here's what the press release didn't say. Apple rolling out a video podcast experience inside podcasts has almost nothing to do with video. This is a platform retention play. Full stop. Think about what's actually happening. YouTube is eating creator attention. Spotify is writing checks to lock up talent, and Apple, the company that invented the modern podcast ecosystem, has been watching from the sidelines with an app that looks like it was designed in 2015. So yeah, they added video, but the real move is stickiness. Keep creators from defecting. Keep listeners from migrating. This is cable bundling economics, just with AirPods instead of set-top boxes. And before anyone calls this a game changer, let's stress test the bullish narrative for a second, because I've been seeing takes this week about how this signals a video-first future for podcasting. Okay, walk me through the P&L on that. The average mid-tier podcast network is running on CPMs between $18 and $35, with host-read ads doing most of the heavy lifting. You add video production, real video, not somebody's webcam setup, and you're looking at 2 to 5 times the production cost. For what? A YouTube audience that already exists on YouTube? The math doesn't math. Who benefits from the video pivot narrative? Gear companies, production studios, consultants? The actual podcast businesses with 50 employees and 3 solid shows, they need to be asking hard questions about whether chasing video upgrades their unit economics or just upgrades their burn rate. Now, the story I'm actually watching underneath all of this, Netflix. There are conversations happening right now with podcast talent. I'll leave it at that, where Netflix is circling, not to make audio content, to pull top-tier hosts into video formats, original series, docu-series adjacents. And here's why that matters to everyone in this room. The moment Netflix enters the talent conversation seriously, it reprices every exclusivity deal in the ecosystem. Spotify has been the ceiling on what a platform will pay to lock up a creator. Netflix blows that ceiling off. And Apple, ironically, just handed Netflix a gift. By signaling that video is the arena, Apple validated exactly the format Netflix dominates. So Apple's video announcement may have just made their own talent retention problem worse. Slow clap for the comms team. Here's the Monday morning question for executives. If you have a creator under contract right now, what's your re-signing leverage in a world where Netflix is in the room? Because we'll distribute you on Apple Podcasts is not a compelling counteroffer when somebody's waiving a Netflix original deal. Bottom line, Apple's move is strategically defensive. The video-first hype doesn't survive contact with a real cost model, and Netflix is the variable nobody's pricing into their talent budgets. Game that out now, or game it out when it's too late. And speaking of monetization math that deserves more scrutiny, we've got 2 case studies coming up that sit at completely opposite ends of the spectrum. A pharma brand spending serious money to get into long-form audio, and a celebrity who built a podcast business with almost zero effort, on purpose. Both of them tell you something important about where the real money is moving.
Okay, we talked Apple and Netflix repricing talent. Now let's follow the money somewhere less obvious. 2 stories this week that look nothing alike, and together tell you everything about where monetization demand is sitting untapped. First, AbbVie's Persistence Lab, a branded podcast, pharma, long-form audio. And before anyone rolls their eyes, hear me out, because the CPM math here is genuinely interesting. Pharma and healthcare branded content routinely clears $50 to $80 CPM. Endemic advertisers, your mattress brands, your VPNs, you're lucky to see $25. That's not a rounding error. That's a different business. So when a company like AbbVie commits to a branded series, they're not dipping a toe in. They're signaling that legal and compliance cleared a long-form audio strategy. And that is a heavy lift internally. Once pharma legal says yes once, the category opens up. Here's what the press release didn't say. This is a demand signal, not a one-off. Healthcare is dramatically underpenetrated in podcast advertising relative to what it spends in print, in digital, in TV. The infrastructure to capture that spend is finally mature enough, the measurement, the brand safety tools, that compliance teams can get comfortable. Pointedly, if you run a network with any health, wellness, or science adjacency, and you don't have a pharma outreach strategy, you are leaving money on the table. Full stop. Now, Rich Paul. This is the gift that keeps giving. So, Rich Paul, LeBron's agent, one of the most powerful figures in sports representation, launches a podcast. And by all accounts, it is deliberately low effort. Minimal production, inconsistent cadence, not optimized for anything resembling growth. The pod community called it undercooked. I'd call it rational. Here's the frame. Rich Paul does not need listener counts. He needs a media asset that signals cultural presence to the next generation of athlete clients, to brand partners, to potential co-investors. The podcast is not the product. The podcast is the proof of concept that he exists in this space. Think about what he's actually buying with a low-effort pod. Deal optionality. The ability to say, we have an audio presence when sitting across from a Spotify or an Endeavor or a media holding company. That's worth more than a 200,000 download episode. I was in rooms during our network acquisition when buyers asked about the brand footprint before they asked about downloads. Rich Paul understands that instinctively. The unit economics of celebrity IP leverage have nothing to do with listenership. So here's the Monday morning question for every executive listening. AbbVie is hunting for content partners. Rich Paul is hunting for deal flow. Are you positioned to meet either of them where they actually are? Which brings me to something that's going to complicate the whole ecosystem: regulation and new format pressure hitting simultaneously. Let's get into that.
Okay, shifting gears from monetization upside to regulatory downside. 2 stories worth flagging. First, BBC Sounds just launched Top Comment, a format built around surfacing listener comments as editorial content. Sounds cute. Here's what the press release didn't say. The BBC has a public mandate, unlimited content budget, and zero CPM pressure. When they move into platform-native interactive formats, they're not experimenting. They're land-grabbing creator attention in a market where independent UK networks are already squeezed. Think cable bundling economics. The incumbent with infrastructure advantages bundles adjacent formats until the independents can't compete on reach. We watched radio do this in the 90s. This is that. The Monday morning question for any network with UK audience exposure: what format moat do you actually have that a public broadcaster can't replicate for free? Now, the more pressing story. The California Privacy Protection Agency launched its own podcast. Cute, right? Wrong. Follow the money, or in this case, follow the enforcement posture. The CPPA doesn't launch a podcast to educate. They launch it to telegraph. What they're signaling is an active enforcement expansion into data brokerage, behavioral targeting, and cross-context tracking, which hits podcast ad tech stacks directly. Here's what's specific: podcast attribution infrastructure, pixel-based retargeting, IP matching, device graph stitching. All of it sits in CPPA's crosshairs under the CCPA's contractor and service provider definitions. If your ad tech vendor is processing California listener data, you have exposure. Full stop. When I was doing PE diligence, we passed on a network where the hosting contract locked them into a platform with deteriorating fill rates. The real risk wasn't obvious until you pulled the vendor agreements. 18 months later, that network sold for 40 cents on the dollar. Same logic applies here. The compliance risk isn't in your main legal agreements, it's buried in your measurement vendor's data processing addendum. When did you last audit that? If the answer is, I'll have someone check, that's already too late. CPPA enforcement isn't hypothetical. They've issued notices. This is a Q3 action item, not a watch list. All right, we've covered platform strategy, monetization signals, and now the regulatory perimeter tightening. Before we close, I want to zoom out, because the real question is, which of these moves actually compound into structural shifts, and which are just noise?
All right. Before we close, one thing worth flagging, and it ties everything together: sports podcasts, specifically what they reveal about the engaged listening question. Sox Machine, the Rich Paul adjacent sports content, all of it. Here's the thing. These shows consistently index higher on completion rates, higher on mid-roll ad recall, higher on subscriber conversion. That's not a coincidence. And yet, most boards are still demanding download numbers. Downloads in 2024. Look, I've been saying this for years. Conflating downloads with actual engaged listeners is like a radio group in 1998 bragging about signal reach while ignoring the diary. The metric that doesn't measure attention isn't measuring your business. Sports pods prove that engaged listening is real, it's measurable, and it commands a premium. If your analytics team isn't surfacing completion curves and return listener rates, that's a Monday morning conversation. Now, the forward look. We covered a lot of ground this week. Apple's video UX play, Netflix circling talent, pharma CPMs, the CPPA enforcement posture. Which of these compounds into structural shift, and which is noise? Here's my read. Apple and the CPPA are structural. 18 months from now, your distribution strategy and your ad tech stack will look fundamentally different because of both. Netflix is a slow burn variable that's about to accelerate. And pharma-branded content? That demand is here now. That's not an 18-month story. That's a Q3 story. BBC's top comment? Interesting. UK relevant, probably a footnote everywhere else. The through line on all of it. Platform power is consolidating, compliance costs are rising, and the premium is going to attention, not reach. If you're not gaming this out, your competitors already are. That's the download. We'll see you next week. Okay, that's the episode. If I had to distill everything we covered today into one sentence, here it is. The gap between what the industry is announcing and what the unit economics actually support has never been wider. And that gap is where the real decisions are getting made. I mean, we went from Apple's video rollout, which, let's be honest, is cable bundling with AirPods, to Rich Paul treating his podcast like a proof of concept term sheet. Two very different plays. Same underlying logic, optionality
is the asset. And look, the one that's going to keep me up tonight, the CPPA signal. That's not a watch list item anymore. If your ad tech stack is running pixel-based attribution or device graph infrastructure, you should be in a room with legal before Q3, not after. Follow the money. And right now, the money is also following the regulators. But here's what I genuinely find interesting about this moment. The pharma CPM story. AbbVie clearing $50 to $80 against endemic rates, half that. That is not a one-off. Once PharmaLegal says yes once, the category opens. That's a structural demand signal, and most mid-sized networks haven't even called those buyers yet. If you're not gaming that out, your competitors already are. All right, quick ask before you go. If anything from today landed for you, forward this episode to one person in your network who needs to hear it. One person. That's the whole ask. Word of mouth is still the only algorithm that actually works in this industry. Tips, feedback, deal intel you want us to dig into, we're at heymatto@thedownload.com. Genuinely read everything that comes in. And if you're not subscribed yet, come on, you made it to the outro. That's commitment. Tap subscribe, leave a rating if you're feeling generous. It matters more than the platforms want you to think it does. Next episode, more signals, less noise. That's always the mandate. Thanks for being here. I'm Reid Mercer. This is The Download. Do your Q3 homework.